Hi, my name is Ann Rutkowski, and I am the co-founder of Cure CMD, and I would like to share with you a short presentation on SIP ventilation in congenital muscular dystrophy. What is SIP ventilation? SIP ventilation is a strategy that has actually been around since the 1950s. It is a strategy that was first designed for polio survivors, and it may also be called mouthpiece ventilation or sip and puff. And it is a way to provide breathing support throughout the day to individuals with muscle weakness who require that breathing support without having to use a mask over the face, such as what is used in BiPAP, or over the nose, or needing a tracheostomy. It takes 4 items to set up SIP ventilation. The first is a ventilator that allows one to program the settings to support SIP ventilation, and many different ventilators can be used to support SIP ventilation. It also will require a mouthpiece or straw, which is at the patient's end. And this is a straw that can either be positioned very close to the mouth, or if the person has the ability, the strength, and the mobility to lift the mouthpiece up to their mouth, then that is another option. And then one needs some kind of flexible modular tubing for an individual who cannot lift the mouthpiece up to their mouth, and a clamp to hold that tubing in place. Another group has designed a very interesting strategy, which is a lightweight harness that goes over the shoulders and around the neck that allows the tubing to be attached to that harness so that the tubing isn't attached to the chair but to the actual patient. And this ensures potentially increased safety in that the tubing will move with the person and not with the chair. Here are 2 examples using the Trilogy ventilator. It is the typical ventilator setup with your flexible tubing, the non-modular tubing, and then you have a stiffer piece with a stiff mouthpiece or straw. And the mouthpiece can either be spread out and phalanged or smaller and more like a straw. This in part depends on the comfort level of the individual and around which piece they can create a better mouth seal. This is an example of a power chair that is set up for SIP ventilation. You have the ventilator on the back, and then you have your modular tubing that allows the tubing within it to obtain a certain shape, and then you have your straw or mouthpiece on the end. This is the harness system that I was referring to. It's a lightweight harness that goes around the neck and to which the rigid portion of the tubing is attached, and that ensures that whenever the patient moves or shifts, that the SIP ventilator will be found very close to them and allows them greater access and ensured safety that they will not be without their SIP ventilator. So who needs SIP ventilation? So this is any child or adult with CMD, or for that matter, any neuromuscular condition, who requires breathing support during the day and who has the swallowing capacity that won't allow them to have interference from their swallowing and their breathing. And we call this in medicine that they have preserved bulbar function. So let's talk briefly about breathing issues in CMD. First and foremost, it is important to recognize that breathing issues in CMD are progressive. This means that most children start off after birth without needing any breathing support, and then will slowly need breathing support first at night. And that breathing support is again with BiPAP or bi-level non-invasive ventilation, not CPAP. Over time, that person may need breathing support during the day. And some of the more common scenarios where you will see that the person with CMD may start to need breathing support during the day is when they are sick, when they are fatigued, or when they are going on an airplane and are traveling at a higher elevation or are vacationing at a higher elevation. And then a person with CMD will need to transition to breathing support during the day. Now, traditionally in the past, that was the time when people with CMD were offered the option of tracheostomy and a ventilator or invasive ventilation. However, SIP ventilation provides a different alternative, a non-invasive alternative that will allow a person with CMD to continue to use their BiPAP settings at night with their interface, whether it's by nose or full face, and then during the day use SIP ventilation, two non-invasive strategies to get continuous ventilation support throughout the day and the night. I would like to pause there just to state that the availability of SIP ventilation should also allow individuals with CMD to be more proactive in making a transition to daytime breathing support at potentially an earlier age than would have been possible in the past, when people would really struggle with the decision to pursue a tracheostomy, and inevitably that would then lead to a delay in terms of starting full-time daytime support. So this next slide is a very important slide, and this slide talks about how we measure breathing capacity in CMD. And breathing issues and breathing capacity in CMD and in all people with a neuromuscular disorder is measured through measuring a value called forced vital capacity, and this is abbreviated FVC. The forced vital capacity is one of the tests that is performed when you go in for pulmonary function testing. And this is the test where you have a cardboard tube that is placed in your mouth. You are asked to inhale fully, exhale fully, inhale fully, and then give one hard and long exhale and try and get all of the air out. And the measure of how much air volume you can get out in milliliters or in liters is then compared to how much air a person could out who doesn't have a muscle condition, who is your same height and age. And then your value is the percentage of that value in somebody who is not affected is what the percent predicted is. And that is the number that is very important for individuals and families with CMD to trend over time. So that is called the percent predicted forced vital capacity. And you can see these are all actually percentages, and it should go up to 100, but I cut my graph off at 80%. And what I'd like to show you here are two different individuals with CMD and what happens to their forced vital capacity over time. Now, it's important to orient yourself to the fact that the first point on this graph happens at the age of 5 years, because this is typically when we start checking forced vital capacity. So at the age of 5 years, a child should be able to follow the commands to do a forced vital capacity maneuver. And in CMD, this is somewhat of a generalization, but I think it's helpful to understand. Typically, kids with CMD who do not acquire the ability to walk will have a lower forced vital capacity than kids who acquire the ability to walk. So the starting points may be somewhat different. However, in both groups over time, there will be a slow but steady progressive decline in forced vital capacity that will be ongoing. The person who starts at a higher forced vital capacity is going to hit the lower number later, and therefore interventions may be delayed in that individual. I have marked 3 important stars on the bottom. The first star is that at age 5 years, every child with CMD should start having annual, if not every 6-month, pulmonary function tests to check their forced vital capacity. If their forced vital capacity is less than 60%, and some would even argue if it is under 80%, a baseline sleep study should be obtained. If that sleep study shows that there are drops in oxygen level, or more importantly, an increase in carbon dioxide overnight, that is an indication to start bi-level non-invasive ventilatory support, or BiPAP. On average, kids with CMD will require going on BiPAP somewhere between ages 10 and 12, although there are individuals who require the start of BiPAP at a much earlier age. And then the third star is after an individual's CMD has been on BiPAP, and in particular I'm talking about the individuals who start with a lower forced vital capacity, somewhere between age 17 to age 22, they will need to start thinking about daytime breathing support, which is SIP ventilation. These two interventions of nighttime breathing support and daytime breathing support will also be required for the person who starts at a higher forced vital capacity. However, the timing of when these two need to happen may be more delayed. So it may just happen at a later age. However, the only way to know whether or not you require these interventions is to evaluate both the symptoms and to do objective testing with the help of your breathing specialists or pulmonologists. So let's talk again about this decline in breathing function in CMD. First of all, it's important to recognize that it occurs gradually. And one of the most important lessons that I have learned in talking to families, in particular families who are newly diagnosed, is when I talk to them about this decline in breathing function, families tell me, but there's no problem here. My child doesn't have any issues with breathing. However, when their breathing function is assessed by forced vital capacity, it is less than 80%, and we know that it is impaired. So what that tells us is that kids and adults with CMD may not have any symptoms that scream out loud that they are having a breathing issue. They are not going to say that they feel short of breath or they have difficulty breathing. The symptoms that one might have with a decline in breathing function are quite vague, and they include things like fatigue, morning headaches, difficulty concentrating, difficulty projecting your voice. So in a classroom setting, you may notice that over time you are less likely to be heard because you just have less air volume traveling across your vocal cords. There may also be a loss of appetite and weight loss or an inability to gain weight. And there also can be increased irritability and a decreased ability to generate a cough, which can be measured through peak cough flow by your pulmonologist, and therefore an increased number of chest infections. I'd also like to talk about one other reason why people with CMD may not really notice that they're having increasing fatigue and increasing breathing issues, and that is because people with CMD are master adapters. As they start to have a decline in breathing function, they will just do less or find ways of how to do it without exerting themselves as much because they are preventing themselves from becoming even more fatigued. And one of the really important things to think about when you think about breathing function is that breathing is giving people energy. And so when our breathing is not optimized, our energy levels are not optimal. And that in part can then lead to all of these symptoms. In fact, I've had one parent describe to me that the way they sold their child on a BiPAP machine is that they told their child that this was an energy machine and that this energy machine was very useful and would give their child energy. And I think that this is a wonderful way to think about the breathing function issue in CMD. So how do you know if you have breathing issues during the day? Well, there are a couple of things that you can check yourself, and then there are a couple of items that your doctor can check for you. So one, you can start to ask yourself whether you're experiencing any of these symptoms. And again, because they happen so gradually, you may not really notice it. But there are some ways that you can think about this more objectively. So one, you can do an experiment, and if you're already on BiPAP, you can start putting yourself on BiPAP for 1 to 2 hours in the afternoon, after school or after a particularly long day, out of the house on the weekend or after work, and see if it makes a difference in your energy level, your appetite, and your sleep. And if you start to do this routinely and notice that this in fact does make a difference, you may in fact be a candidate for SIP ventilation, because what you're starting to do is actually provide yourself with daytime breathing support. The other objective way of measuring a breathing issue is actually to chart your weight and to do it over a longer time period. So in younger children and in teenagers who are still growing, during any period of growth, you should see an increase in weight. You should not see a stabilization of weight nor a drop in weight. And as an adult, once you've reached kind of your maximal weight, you should not have a drop off in weight unless you are overweight. For those individuals who are overweight, it is important to also trend your weight, because optimizing your breathing function may actually enable you to lose weight, because it can give you more energy to move around. And then there are 3 tests that your doctor can check. One of those is the forced vital capacity. However, I will add that when people get to a pretty low forced vital capacity, there is maybe a little bit less of an accuracy factor, because the numbers get so small in terms of how much volume you're able to get out. The most important thing that can be done is to assess your symptoms together with you, and then to measure your carbon dioxide levels during the day. And it is helpful to measure them both when you wake up and at the end of the day, and to see if you're having a rise in CO2 levels throughout the day. And if you are, then you are definitely a candidate for SIP ventilation. And then it's also important to repeat your sleep study and ensure that your BiPAP settings have been optimized if you are already on BiPAP. So who with CMD might benefit from SIP ventilation? One, it is typically somebody who has already been a BiPAP user for several years at night. It's somebody who may notice that they're having increasing fatigue and may notice a benefit to going on their BiPAP machine in the afternoon. And it may also be somebody who has never acquired the ability to walk or has recently lost their walking ability. So for all of these individuals who fall into this type of a combined category, I would like to encourage you to reach out to your pulmonologist and discuss whether SIP ventilation is something that might actually be of benefit. Like any new equipment or toy, whether it's a car, a ventilator, a computer, it's important to take it for a test drive, but to go into it knowing that this isn't something that you're immediately going to gravitate to. It's going to take some adjustments made by the doctor and also adjustments made by yourself. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slides. So the benefits that have been reported for non-invasive ventilation include relieving symptoms, reducing work of breathing, improving or stabilizing gas exchange, improving the duration and quality of sleep, maximizing the quality of life, and prolonging survival. And I would like to say, even though this study was not made for SIP ventilation, that in fact this is what SIP ventilation is doing as well. And you really want to think of SIP ventilation as kind of step number 2, and that being proactive and assessing whether you're having these symptoms and whether it's time to start SIP ventilation is an important thing for all of us to consider. So what is the evidence that SIP ventilation will improve quality of life? Number 1, this was a study that was published by Michel Toussaint, and I will provide the reference at the end of this PowerPoint. And it was a study to look at the short-term and long-term impact of SIP ventilation on young men with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. There were 43 participants with Duchenne who were between the ages of 15 and 33 years. All had been on BiPAP at night for an average of already 4.5 years before starting SIP ventilation. And that's in part similar to what we see in the CMD community. So if you start BiPAP somewhere on average between age 10 and 12, that's somewhere between ages 16 and 20, you may start to derive a benefit from daytime SIP ventilation. All were wheelchair bound by age 12 years, and the average forced vital capacity at initiating SIP ventilation was 11% plus or minus 4. So that means it was anywhere between 15% and 7%. And they were all found, all these individuals were found to have elevated carbon dioxide levels during the day. So during this 5-year study, once they were started on SIP ventilation, what was found is that it stabilized the forced vital capacity for over the 5-year course. It reduced their daytime carbon dioxide levels and significantly improved the symptoms, which in part were greatly related to fatigue. And then in the long term, it improved survival to 50% at 31 years, which was an improvement over comparative studies done in other countries. So I'd like to provide you with two resources that are personal experiences with SIP ventilation. The first is Luke Hoban's video on SIP ventilation, and the second is John Hasty's blog on life with DMD. Luke Hoban has CMD and John Hasty has DMD, and I think both of them will provide you with very interesting information on SIP ventilation. To access John Hasty's blog, you can go to this following link, and he has two entries in his blog post on first starting SIP ventilation and then giving further feedback on how it's going. As I had said before, it takes time to adjust and adapt to new equipment. Some of the adaptations that you'll need to work on with your physician is whether the ventilator mode that you have programmed on is the mode that makes you feel the most comfortable, and how to set it up, including how the tubing is either secured to yourself or to the chair. And this is really important because once you start to rely on SIP ventilation, you're going to need to be able to access it when you need it. You may need to relearn how to breathe, and this was a point that was really well made by John Hasty in his blog. So many individuals with CMD are used to on BiPAP that the machine will kick in breath and you don't need to initiate the breath. However, to get a breath assisted ventilation, you need to initiate it. And then once you initiate it, you're going to have this volume that comes at you through the straw. So you're going to need to learn how to create a seal with pursed lips around that straw or mouthpiece in order to capture that volume, not just in your mouth, but also to keep your cheeks a little taut so that you can actually get it to go into your lungs. Part of the challenge initially is figuring out how much of that volume you want to let come in and how much you want to leak out. And then how to coordinate the talking and the breathing and the holding of the straw and the grabbing of the straw or the mouthpiece. But just with any new piece of equipment, with practice, one achieves perfection, and it becomes something that becomes second nature. And then a very important point that has been made is that those individuals who derive the greatest benefits with SIP ventilation are typically individuals who are risk takers and can learn how to breath stack, which means to take multiple breaths without exhaling in between in order to expand their lungs to the fullest capacity and thus minimize any compressed lung tissue, maintain their lung function, and achieve the ability to generate a larger cough volume when coughing. All things that promote greater survival, in particular in the setting of an infection. So finally, I'd like to leave you with two resources. One is a paper that was published, an evaluation of home volume ventilators that can support open circuit mouthpiece ventilation or SIP ventilation, and that was published in 2005. And then the second was this publication, the study that I just mentioned, published by Toussaint, diurnal ventilation via mouthpiece survival in Duchenne patients. I'd like to thank you for your attention and hope that this has been a helpful presentation.